Alright guys, ready to go?
We have a room.
So, it's nice to meet you. If I haven't met you already, my name is Elliott Reid. Now, primarily I'm an osteopath and the owner of the Revitalised Clinic, where we help 6,500 individuals become pain-free, mentally well and physically fit. So I suppose you could say that I've had a passion for a little while on helping people to better themselves. And I'd say that history has done the same thing for me. Now the issue was, obviously, growing up in Britain, being of Jamaican descent, the history that I suppose, inherited by growing up in Britain was that you were a slave for kind of 300-400 years, and you've been kind of a little bit of a nuisance, and you contributed a little bit ever since. It's not the most uplifting of historical stories or of history to portray to someone. So I decided to dig a bit deeper, and what I found was completely transformational for me. In fact, I could say that by knowing my historical self, by knowing the history that I've inherited, it's transformed my esteem, it's transformed my confidence, and it's enabled me to contribute to other people and to myself as good as I can. Now, the importance of history is, as I've said, history has the potential to be incredibly empowering. History channels itself throughout our cultural norms to create cultural norms which we enjoy today, even though we might not realise the historical origin of that. But the other thing is that history offers us the opportunity to become critical, to analyse the past, to pick it to pieces and understand how we today could do better than what happened previously. The issues are that many of us in this room today, including myself, are the descendants of British subjects, which mean that we descend from people who for 300 years plus were under colonial rule. The issue, once again, is that it's very, very difficult to rule over a people who you oppress if you think of them as your equals. That meant that the British Empire, during their rule, over 25% of the world's population and service, had to demean the people who they were oppressing and take away anything which might uplift them in their esteem and in their sense of self. Now, I think that the harm that was done during this period of time hasn't been addressed to the point where individuals of the Commonwealth have a good enough sense of self or identity to lift themselves up and lift themselves up in their esteem and realise the contributions that they made to the world as we know it today. Now, today we're going to correct that. We're going to rethink history over that period of time and before that. We're going to have a look at why human beings are different. Why are we different as human beings in comparison to other primates and other members of the animal kingdom? We're also going to look at how great ancient Egypt was and how many of their feats still are not outdone today. We're going to have a look at Africa's golden age, West Africa, the Moors, and how the Moors, a North African civilization, contributed to life as we know it in Europe today in a big, big way. And we're also going to look at the interaction between the African diaspora and Britain over the ages. Now, the learning objectives today. We need to create a more globalised sense of self, more globalised students. The world that you guys are going into is very, very, very different to the world which your parents went into. The world is a much smaller place where we have access to information much more readily, and it's very, very likely that you are going to have to interact with people of different ethnicity, different religious backgrounds on a far greater level than your parents might have. Understanding the historical context and the cultural context of where these people come from will massively help you, I assure you. As well as this, we want to understand how the civilization and the privileges that we enjoy today come from a multi-ethnic and a multicultural contribution to modernity. We want to look at the true history of Africa, removing the imperial propaganda which we have been subject to over years. Now, to do this, we're going to split, say, today's lesson in two. We're going to talk about, so the first half of the lesson, we're going to bring up to scratch pre-colonial African history, or pre-colonial history, and then after that we're going to learn about post-colonial history. Now, the story begins 300,000 years ago, where human beings first stepped on the stage. And the earliest human fossils have been found in North Africa. One about 200,000 years ago, Northeast Africa, and the other in Northwest Africa, which is dated to about 300,000 years ago. Now, when human beings stepped on the stage, we had a number of mutations which gave rise to three main gifts, which separate us from other members of the animal kingdom and other primates. One is our consciousness. Now, I want you to imagine a wolf or another animal. This animal will rely on their instincts. Imagine a ship on the ocean with no captain, just crew members, and the crew members are rowing. And when a wave hits them this way, they steer a little bit to the right. And when the weather's bad, they cover their heads. And they have no control over what they do, they're just rowing and going with the motions. Now, you put a captain on that ship, and that captain can then decide the direction at which that ship is heading. It can decide where they want to go, what they want to do. And that's exactly what our consciousness does for us. We can see our minds from a bird's eye perspective. We might feel anger, but we can put it to one side and realise that a better job needs to be done, so we'll dedicate ourselves to that instead. We can put things off for a little while because we know that something better might come if we do. That conscious ability to have a bird's eye perspective and look down upon our brains and understand how the different components of different cogs work has massively helped us to develop us into the human beings and the modern human beings and that gives rise to the privileges and the civilization that we enjoy today. The other is imagination, the ability to take certain truths and predict the future based on those truths. To say that I know this exists, and I know that if I put these together, within 4 years, this might come. It's the reason why you're here today, right? Human beings have the imagination to say that if I dedicate myself to 3 or 4 years of study, at the end of that, after I've accumulated all that knowledge, I think I'll be in a better place. That ability to imagine the future is another thing that makes us quite unique. And the third is meaning, our ability to personify our environments, our ability to take meaning from different components of our environment. And meaning is going to become very, very important very soon in this lecture. Now, what is interesting is that, yes, human beings evolved around 300,000 years ago, but it took 290,000 years for human beings to understand that if they take certain seeds and they put them in the ground and they nurture them, that they'll grow into plants that they can eat. Now, this meant that we didn't have to spend so much time looking for food and chewing our food. In fact, hunter-gatherers on average spend about 4 hours a day chewing their food. That's half a working day, chewing their food. So, 290,000 years later, human beings discovered that they can put seeds into the ground and grow their food. That means a lot of time was freed up. Less than 10,000 years later, after this occurrence of the first farms, we have King Nama from the Sudan, who travels into Upper Egypt, which is southern Egypt. And he takes his men into Upper Egypt, and he builds the banks of the Nile. The Nile would flood on a very, very regular basis, which meant it would turn the surroundings into swampland. But where Nama wanted to farm, he built up the banks of the river so he could control the floods and he could control irrigation. Now, up until that point, no one had fed more people on the planet per acre of land than the ancient Egyptians, and that's what they were able to do. And this developed into advanced farming practices, which meant that human beings had to spend less time looking for food, and it meant that they could spend more time thinking, which is where we start to get specialist dedications or specialist trades starting to develop. We start to see builders, architects, scientists, teachers, because people can start to become specialized based on their unique skill sets. But let's expand on this thought that people had more time to think and draw upon this unique human trait to draw meaning from their surroundings. This is where we start to see the first myths occurring on the planet. Now, myths, we can say, are the ability to reflect and personify not just the external world, but the internal world as well. Where we might experience as human beings anger or darkness and light, and as well as that the unconscious ability to give birth to both, we then start to see myths forming around these experiences. which we'll go into later. Now, let's have a look at this myth of Horus, Set, Osiris, and Isis. These are them in their original forms here. Now, this is one of the early ancient Egyptian myths. We've got Osiris, who represents order and culture. You can think of him as Mufasa. He's the old kingdom, the old way of doing things. And we've got his evil brother Set, who represents chaos and destruction. And we've got Isis, Osiris's wife. Set grows jealous of Osiris. They battle. Osiris is cut into 1,000 pieces and banished to the underworld. Isis then takes the penis of Osiris and impregnates herself with it, and she gives birth to Horus, who symbolises light and truth and good. Horus then defeats his evil uncle Set, goes down into the underworld, rescues his father, and gives his father his eye, which is the eye of truth and foresight and enlightenment. And then we have the unification of truth, progress, and as well as that, the old culture as one. That's why you guys might see, has anyone seen the triangle with the eye in the middle? Yeah, that comes from the myth of Horus, Osiris, Set, and Isis. Now, the reason why this myth was so important to the ancient Egyptians is it enabled them to develop a philosophy of a balance between good and evil. The myth would go that Horus and Set would battle every night. Every evening they would battle. And the reason why is that evil never dies. Evil is a daily struggle to battle against evil, which is, I think, we can draw a meaning from that which is applicable to our daily lives, as the ancient Egyptians thought. Here we start to see Ma'at form, which is the ancient Egyptian philosophy of the balance between good and evil. Now, because there was such ethical precedence, there was such a focus on ethics in ancient Egypt, it entwined itself into the economy, which meant that rather than rely on, say, the free market like we do today, in ancient Egypt, having a house to live in was a birthright. Having enough food to eat was a birthright. If at any point in time the stocks of grain started to reduce, which it very rarely did, the people would very quickly write against the pharaoh, whose responsibility it was to promote Ma'at and to banish evil, which was Isfet, and he would then create a surplus of grain to give to the people. But what's interesting is that today we often view socialism as a slowing down of the economy, but this is very much a socialist endeavour. And during this time, we see some of the most magnificent structures that have ever graced the planet Earth. Okay, put your hand up if you're a mathematician here. All right, cool. So I just want your input here. If I was to ask you to build a structure which was 480 foot tall, incorporated Pythagoras' theorem to create a perfect pyramid, and I wanted this structure to coordinate between the north, east, and southwest poles, I also wanted it to correlate or point into the direction of a pole star, which was Thurbin back then, but will be the North Star today. I wanted it to also align with Orion's belt, pi, incorporate the calculation of pi, incorporate the calculation of the Earth's circumference, and I want you to do this to the accuracy of 1/720th. Would that be a difficult thing to do? Would that be a difficult thing to do?
Yes.
Right. That's what the pyramids do. They incorporate all of these mathematical calculations, and Pharaoh Khufu built these thousands of years ago, 4,000, arguably even 5,000 years ago. And not just this, those structures are still unreplicable today because of the complications and because we don't have that accuracy of building structures. I think a group of Chinese scientists had tried to create a 60-foot replica of the pyramid using these calculations, and they couldn't do it. So it also gives light to the fact that information and technology isn't necessarily linear. It doesn't get better as human beings go on. For example, if we lost the information to make a light bulb, put your hands up if you think you could actually make it again. If you had to make it from scratch, it'd be quite a difficult thing to do, right? So as we see the fall and the rises of empires, we unfortunately see the falls and rises of technology that come with them. But not only the pyramids were impressive, the Temple of Karnak, I take it you guys have seen Notre Dame Cathedral, which unfortunately burnt down, was it a year or two ago? Now, the Temple of Karnak was so huge that it could fit the Notre Dame Cathedral in just its entrance hall. And it was built 4,000 years BC. Huge structures, using stones that weigh over a ton, that were dragged or transported hundreds of miles away from where they are today. However, due to internal conflict and due to external invasions into ancient Egypt, we see Egypt change quite a lot over its, say, 5,600 year history until it was eventually absorbed into the Roman Empire, with Queen Cleopatra being the last pharaoh, and it absorbed into the Roman Empire in 30 BC. Now, we've discussed how myths have similarities all over the world. Religions have similarities all over the world. I want to ask you this question. This is a picture of the ancient Egyptian depiction of the afterlife. Now, you might not be able to see it here, but we've got Anubis, who is guardian of the underworld, and Anubis, which will be under the guidance of Osiris, is weighing up a heart, which is what carries sin in ancient Egypt, and the feather of Ma'at. And he's looking to see if they balance. And he'll pass judgment on if they balance, and if it's good, they'll go free into the afterlife. If they don't, then their soul, i.e. their car, will be destroyed. This is one myth. The other myth is we have the son who does what the father can't. The myth of the son doing what the father can't, of going into the underworld, going into death to give light to humanity. And the last here, we've got the depiction of evil, which is, say, a beast with 2 horns or 2 long ears. And this represents Satan. Can you tell me where you might have seen these symbols before, these myths before? Say again?
Christianity.
Which one?
All 3 of them.
Yeah, you could say all 3. We're going to look at that in a second. Now, the depiction of... Has anyone else got any others? Any other times that you've seen these symbols? Has anyone seen anyone weighing 2 things to describe, to justify whether or not someone is guilty or innocent?
The courthouse.
Courthouse. Exactly. So, I'll show you. We have Lady Justice doing the same thing here. She's weighing the good feats and the bad feats of that individual to decide whether they're guilty or not. We've got Jesus of Nazareth, who went into death to bring light to human beings, or to the world. And we've also got Baphomet, who is commonly looked at as being a pagan representation of the devil. Now, we've got 2 questions here. Were these myths transferred over time, or is it something else from happening? What are your thoughts on this? Why might these myths replicate themselves over and over again? Yeah.
Because as humans, we all started from the same place. Therefore, based on our similar experiences at the beginning of time, we kind of had like similar perspectives and similar reasons to do things, and therefore that sort of created myths that are similar on the base of it, but have like different little things.
Absolutely, that's one theory, 100%, that these myths come from within us, and that these are more of a depiction of our internal struggle than they are external environment. Yes, Lou?
Or we don't have an answer to everything, then we would rely on myths because they somehow fit into what we're looking at.
Right.
If we don't have an answer to something, these myths somehow answer it.
Right, so that's us as human beings trying to extract meaning from our environment. Is that what you're saying? 100%. And this is what we spoke about in the first slide, which is that we as human beings try to draw meaning from our environment based on the meaning that we draw from within us. So we have this, for example, this potential in our minds, and a lot of, say, early psychologists would call this the Ouroboros, or they'd call it the unconscious potential. And we have certain things or elements which come from this, whether that is, say, the 7 deadly sins, because every single one of us has the potential to feel angry, greedy, prideful, lustful. That's all within us. And there are theories that rather than, and it is possible that certain deities have visited us at different points in the planet over time, but there's the other possibility that these myths are more of our internal story, which we have then portrayed into the external environment, which we're trying to draw meaning from, 100%. Any questions at all? All good? All right. So, next slide. Now, shortly after the fall of Rome, shortly after Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire in 30 BC, in around 400 AD, we have the Dark Ages, which is the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, I want to ask you this. What do you think would happen if Parliament crashed overnight and it ceased to exist anymore? What do you reckon would happen to the UK? Shambles, yeah? What would happen to our food?
Disappear.
Sorry?
Disappear.
Disappear? Would the free market still be here, or would it disappear? Stock market, would that plummet? Would that crash, or would it still be here? Crash? What about our NHS? Our military servicemen? They would go, right? Now, this is exactly what happened during the fall of the Roman Empire. We have widespread famine, tribal warfare. One way to look at it is, say when you guys were 14 or 15, tell me what happened as soon as the teacher left the room. Havoc, right? Every man for themselves, throw balls around, insults, all of this. That's what happened in Western Europe during the Dark Ages. We have widespread famine, conflict, violence, even cannibalism at this point in time, where due to food shortages. However, even though Europe was going through a dark age at this time, Africa was about to endure a golden age. We start to see the formation of ancient Ghana and the Yoruba tribes, Mali and Benin. We see the cultivation of palms and yams as these individuals from Northeast Africa or Central Africa start to migrate towards West Africa, and with them they bring farming practices and the cultivation of palm and yams for growth and for consumption and for trade. Islam also spread via trade, and we see huge amounts of wealth forming in West Africa in the form of gold and literature. Now, at this point in time, during the medieval era of West Africa, we see books start to trade at a far higher cost than gold. Why do you think this is? Why would at this point in time books be more valuable than gold? Yes?
People are valuing knowledge more than intrinsic things like gold.
Why do you think that is?
People want to expand their knowledge of things.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, you're going to say something?
I'm going to say people are curious.
Curious, yeah. But also, supply and demand, right? If you can dig gold out of the ground, and quite a plentiful, and it's a plentiful supply of it, but knowledge is in only in key areas of the globe, then those books in those key areas of the globe are gonna sell for a lot more, right, than the gold itself. As West Africa develops, we start to see the development of one of the key empires in West Africa, which is the Songhai Empire. Now, not only were they incredibly developed when it came to gold and literature and education, but because of the transference of Islam into West Africa, in Islam, you are instructed to pray towards Mecca. And one of the best ways at that time to understand or to ascertain where Mecca is to use the stars. So we start to see astronomical education start to thrive in West Africa as well, which then carried on into nautical navigation, because you can use the stars to navigate your ships. Now, in the 14th century, the king of Songhai, Mansa Abu Bukhari, sent 2,000 ships to westward in the Atlantic to explore what lied beyond the Atlantic. Now, just to put this into perspective, yes, 100%, this is a very, very challenging thing to do. But we have an individual who unfortunately recently passed, who passed the Atlantic in a canoe. So it's very, very likely that at least one of these ships got there. And we have evidence that these ships actually arrived in the Americas before Christopher Columbus. We have what would it be when you dig something up? Is it yeah, we have archaeological findings of African spears, canoes, American villages with Malian names such as Mandinga Port, Mandinga Bay, Sierra de Mali were discovered in America. 2 African skeletons were also found in the Danish Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, which date back to 1250 AD. But not only this, certain civilizations in West Africa have been seen to be in the medieval era, previous to Columbus, patterning their pavements with corn which is an American plant. We also see that there is evidence of cocoa leaves found in the bellies of Egyptian mummies, which indicates that Africa and America were trading for a long time before the Europeans were. Now, in Mansa Abu Bakari's absence, his brother Mansa Musa inherited the throne, and he established Timbuktu. At this point in time in Timbuktu, more people were being educated in the universities of Sankor than there were the population of London. So more people were in university in Timbuktu than there were in the population of London at that time. At least 700,000 of their books are still in circulation today. And Mansa Musa used his money to invest in gold. He invested gold to start to build infrastructure and build a middle class in West Africa. And he is still today the richest man that has ever lived. On his pilgrimage to Mecca, he spent so much gold that he crashed the gold economy of Egypt. And unfortunately, or we can say unfortunately, at the same time we start to see the map of, the Catalan Map, which was a map that the Portuguese drew up of the world. This is Mansa Musa holding a golden nugget. This news then spread to Europe that West Africa was very rich in gold, and this would very soon work to their disadvantage. Now, after this, the descendants of Mansa Musa become fragmented, and they started to argue amongst themselves, and conflicts started to emerge in West Africa, which caused the fragmentation of the West African Empire of Songhai at that time. But I want to ask you this. Mansa Musa used his gold and he invested in education, he invested in the middle classes, and he invested in trying to bring up the economy. We have modern day equivalents, he tried to close the wealth gap, right? We have modern day equivalents of, say, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. Now these individuals have accumulated far more wealth than many countries. What do you think their responsibility should be? Or should they have a responsibility to the greater communities? Yes.
I feel like most people also would like to give them some of their value. But I feel like if you give them some value and you don't give them knowledge of like how to get there, then there won't be a sustainable amount of value that you will give them. So
Yes.
I feel like providing knowledge on how to further develop instead of like just giving them money.
Yeah. So you're talking about investing in infrastructure rather than giving it away, for say. Yeah. What about any other counter arguments to say that, you know, if an individual accumulates great wealth, that they should be able to keep it just for themselves? Yeah.
The argument is that our system teaches the people that are best at utilising their resources to create wealth, that they should maintain the wealth.
Yes.
And maybe Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk wants to create generational wealth so that generations below him can still have wealth. Whereas if you think of it like you're going to give it all away, or you expect them to be charitable, I don't think it's fair to expect them to be charitable.
Right. Okay. Now it's interesting. There's a current move at the moment, by which we're going to explore in a second. Current movement, your current argument that ethics and the economy should become intertwined. So what you're saying is that if I accumulate great wealth, then I should be able to keep it all, right? Do you think there's a certain amount of luck or circumstance that might lead to my accumulation of that wealth? Sorry? You think? Okay, cool. Okay, let me ask you this. So, what's your depiction of, say, Jeff Bezos? How did he make his money?
So he's gone to school. He studied.
Yeah.
So he's got an idea. He's had an intuition.
Yeah.
To start Amazon.
Yes.
Amazon's then
Yes.
blown up.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Now, if I were to tell you that Jeff Bezos took a loan from his stepdad of $300,000 in the 80s, would that change your mind at all as to whether or not you think luck is the main contributor, or whether or not luck contributes to wealth building?
In a sense.
Okay, yeah.
I feel like it depends on his determination. Because say he didn't get that loan of 300,000,
Yeah.
would he have kept the idea, and would he have kept trying to get loans from other places to try and start it? Because if he was not a determined person and his uncle just kind of like put him on,
Yeah.
then maybe he wouldn't have started it. Maybe Amazon would be something different today. So.
True. Okay, cool. No problem. Any other thoughts on this? Yes, dude.
So Jeff Bezos started selling books from his garage.
Yeah.
And so he got his even if he didn't get his £300,000 loan from his stepdad, he still had that idea before before the money came in.
Yeah.
So even if he was making small money, he might not have been as big as he is now due to the loan. But I don't think it's based on luck.
Yeah.
I think it's based on money. Having money equals more money in the future.
Yes.
So if you think about investing in stocks and shares, if you invest in a lot, with a lot, you can gain a lot rather than putting in less. You won't gain as much.
So are you? Yeah, go on.
So I feel like it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a large part of the circumstances that come about is thanks to luck.
Yeah.
But you still need to have something to be able to use that supplement as well.
Yeah.
But just because it does require your own initiative doesn't take away from the fact that you still have responsibility to invest back.
Yes. Absolutely. Say that last bit again for me, please. Say that last bit again for me, please.
Just because like you need that determination to get that wealth
Yes.
doesn't take away from the responsibility you have to invest back.
Absolutely, 100%. Who, just out of interest, who knows what the greatest threats to a business failing are?
Your business.
Say it again.
Your business failing, you said.
Business failing. What's the biggest cause of business failure?
That's subjective, isn't it? There's loads of things.
There are loads of things, but there tends to be one thing that a lot of business people will mention of one over others, yeah?
Bankruptcy.
Say it again.
Bankruptcy.
Bankruptcy is the outcome. What would lead to that? Yes, dude.
Greed.
No. Yeah, go.
Is it when like the cost of production are more than like the profit that I'm
Almost, yeah.
Is it insolvency? Like when you're dead?
It's cash flow. Has anyone heard of that before? That a lot of businesses will plummet and go into bankruptcy because of the lack of cash flow. Yeah. Now, cash flow is essentially the ability to take in money at a higher rate than you're paying it out. So bad cash flow means that you start to go into debt, right? Okay. Now, if I have money to invest in a business, am I more or less likely to have cash flow issues? Less. So can you see here how, yes, absolutely, a lot of business development is about luck, but that if you have money going into business and you have access to certain expertise going into business, you can become unluckier more often and just get lucky once and then succeed as a result. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I'm a business owner myself. I think that a lot of business success is about hard work, determination, having a vision, being quite stoic, being able to take your emotions out of it when you need to, dealing with a lot of pain. But I know, even from my perspective, that I could be unluckier a lot more often the more money that I've been able to accumulate, right? So I think I agree with both sides, all right? Any questions at all? You all good? All right, so we see, previous to this, the fall of the fragmentation of the West African empires. Now we're going to rewind a little bit. We're going to go back to 7th century AD, when the Prophet Muhammad instructed Arabs in the Middle East to seek knowledge. Now, these Arabs converted to Islam, and therefore they could no longer raid each other, because it was against the laws of Islam for a Muslim to raid another fellow Muslim. So they had to expand outwardly very, very quickly. And within 100 years, these Muslims spread across North Africa by both peaceful and violent means, until eventually they start to blend with the native populations, and this is where we get the population of the Moors starting to occur. The Moors were a mixed race civilization, or a multi-ethnic civilization, who all flew the flag of Islam. In the 7th century AD, they go on to occupy Egypt, and they start to extract all of this knowledge, which has been hidden in Egypt for thousands of years. They start to take the Greek classics, the ancient Egyptian texts, and they start to translate it into Arabic. Now the difference is that between Christianity and, say, Islam at this point in time, that it was a Muslim's obligation to be able to read the Quran. This is very different to Christianity in Europe, where only one priest or certain lords, barons in the monarchy were allowed to read it, or were able to read and write. Why do you think that is? That someone of power might hide education away from the masses? Yes, let's go for you again.
They'd hide it from the masses to sort of keep them under their control.
Yeah, what about yourself?
I'm going to say, like, you can tell them what to think.
Yeah, true. Yeah, any other suggestions? Yeah.
Because it will show their superiority, so that they will look at them like some sort of like gods.
So it's hierarchical.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So the Moors start to extract all of this information which has been hidden for thousands of years, and they start to bring it into their empire, and they start to use it to develop civilization across North Africa. Now, in the 7th century AD, Tariq ibn Ziyad successfully invades southern Spain. both by peaceful and violent methods. Peaceful because the Moors had developed such a cultural, were so culturally esteemed and developed that many of the Spaniards at that point in time who were oppressed by the Visigoths wanted to actually be under Moorish rule because they wanted that structure of their communities and of their civilization. So Tariq ibn Ziyad successfully invaded southern Spain. Put your hand up if you've heard of Gibraltar. Alright, so Gibraltar comes from the Arabic, which means Rock of Tariq. So he was so happy with himself that he named Gibraltar after himself. And the Spaniards, like I said, who were dominated by the Visigoths at that time, many of them welcomed the Moors in open arms, but some were also conquered in violent ways. Now what we see here is an intellectual revolution that occurs in... Oh, sorry, I need to keep pressing the slides. We start to see an intellectual revolution that occurs in southern Spain. The Moors bring the Greek classics, their religion, trade, maths. They start to bring the Indian numerical system, so people stop using Roman numerals, which are clunky and difficult to use, and they start using the Indian numbers of 0 to 9. They develop architecture. A man called Zuryab, his nickname was the Blackbird, starts to revolutionize fashion and fine dining and etiquette. People stop wearing the same clothes all year and they start to have different clothes dependent on each season. They start to drink out of crystal glasses rather than chalices. They stop eating with their hands and start eating with knives and forks. All of these innovations start to come into Europe at the time thanks to the Moors. We have music by the oud, which is an early guitar, an Arabic guitar, and literacy and academia. Much of the words which we use today come from the Moors. Algorithm, algebra, alchemy, alcohol, even the game of chess come from the Moors into Europe. So al is a common prefix in Arabic. So if you hear al at the beginning of a word, a lot of the time it was brought into Europe by the Moors. And once again, the development of astronomy as well and nautical navigation. However, the Moors dedicated themselves much more to the infrastructure of the civilization than they did the military, which is when King Ferdinand marries Queen Isabella, they unite Christian Spain and they then push the Moors out of Spain. This is called the Spanish Reconquista. Later, we see the Spanish Inquisition, which is where the Christian Spaniards force the Muslims and the Jews out of Spain. And there were many conversions to Christianity at this time as well. But one town, or one city in specific remained, and that was Toledo. Has anyone heard of Toledo before? It's a city in Spain. Toledo's academic work was untouched. The books were untouched. And the Christians took this and they started to use it for education. And it's arguably that at this point in time we start to see the Renaissance occur in Europe, the Age of Enlightenment, which gave rise to the individuals like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. But there was one individual who studied under the Moors, under the Moors in Arabic institution, and that was Dale of Morley. He then leaves Toledo and he goes back to England and he dedicates himself to building Oxford into a town or a city of academic pursuit, which is where now today Oxford has its reputation of being one of the best universities in the world. Now, I want to ask you this question. How has Islam been framed in recent events? Negatively. How so?
Well, the way it's been portrayed, the way the religion has been portrayed in media, usually associated with terrorist events.
Yeah.
Things like that. So it's being portrayed negatively.
Okay. Now, the Quran hasn't changed since 7th century AD. Islam hasn't changed. So if Islam is the consistent, but people are different, what does this tell us about religion? Can we say that religion is,
I was going to say is how people, it's different people's perspective, how they see the religion.
Yep.
So a lot of people, like let's say Al-Qaeda, all the,
Yep.
those people, they see the Quran and Islam as, so they think what they're doing is right in the name of Allah and stuff like that. Whereas other people see peace as a good thing.
Absolutely.
It's the way they perceive it.
Fantastic. So therefore, should the blame or the sin be on the individual or the religion? Is everyone in agreement with that? No? What do you think?
So you're saying that, so the point is that it should be the fault of the man that made the religion itself?
No. The fault is on the person who does the sin or does the evil rather than the religion itself.
I feel like sometimes, even though like the religion has a good basis,
yes,
when it's very simple, so it will tell you like the simple basis, and as life becomes more complicated, as we like develop as human beings, it's sort of at like from their perspective, it might be, oh, do not kill because this will happen, but it might be like a different situation to somebody who lives now today that sees that and like doesn't really look at it the same way somebody back in 1492.
So you're saying as time goes on, it starts to lose its application.
Yeah, exactly.
Understand that. All right. What do you think the danger is in blanketing a religion as being inherently evil or inherently bad?
Ignorant.
Sorry?
It's being ignorant.
Being ignorant, right. Do you think it's quite likely to offend people? Yeah, and do you think that will cause more harm? All right. So, we're now about to go into the second half of the presentation. Is everyone all right? All good? Okay, sweet. So, we're about to see the fall of Africa as we knew. We're going to see the fall of the golden age of Africa. Now, this starts... Well, let's contextualise the time first. 1492, Christopher Columbus, under the instructions of King... what's his name? Queen Isabella and King... Ferdinand, thank you. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Christopher Columbus, under their instruction, in 1492, ventures off to westwardly in the Atlantic to discover America for the Europeans. In 1578, the Moroccan Sultan and Queen Elizabeth I ally, and they then travel to Songhai, into West Africa, which is already fragmented, and they sack it, and they extract the gold and the goods from that civilization. Shortly after this, the Spaniards are already colonizing the Americas, and they're extracting the gold from the Americas, and they're pushing it into the Spanish Empire. Now, there's two key differences between the Spanish and the British at this point in time. The Spanish have a centralized power structure. Everything comes from the monarch. In Britain, they have a decentralized power structure, i.e. the local lords and barons have more power than the monarchy, right? At this point in time, there are so many Spanish ships coming back from America laden with gold that the British start to become jealous. The British try and do the same thing. British merchants try and do the same thing. They try to go to the Americas to find gold. They can't find any, so they start to then raid Spanish ships on the return from America to Spain. This is where we start to see the population of British pirates starting to really increase. But because the monarchs view, and because the lords and the barons start to view these pirates as possibly being an asset, they start to legalize certain pirates, and that's where we get privateering. And they then start to invest into these individuals. This is where we see, for example, I'll take it, anyone's heard of Captain Morgan Rum? Yeah? So Captain Henry Morgan was a Welshman who raided Spanish ships, took the gold, invested that gold into Jamaica, started to take slaves from Africa and start to farm that land to extract the sugar from that land to then create sugar and rum for the British Empire, which is where we have Captain Morgan Rum today. After extracting this wealth from the Spanish and buying up a lot of land or taking a lot of land in the Americas, the Western European forces, including the British, they needed a labour force. The Native Americans were dying of diseases. Around 90 million of the Native Americans were genocided, either directly through violence or by disease. The indentured servants they took from Europe weren't adapted enough to the environment to farm the land in the Americas, so they then started to look to West Africa. And they started to raid coastal towns in West Africa, and they started to take individuals from these West African towns and put them on slave ships and then send them off to the Americas where they would farm the land. But they decided that this method wasn't quick enough. They needed more slaves to farm the land. So what they then started to do is take their guns to different West African tribes who were already in conflict with each other, and they started to stimulate an arms race. I.e., if you had a problem with you, I'd give you guns, and I want you to then capture your people and then I would give more guns to you if you were then able to give me more prisoners of war. But what this meant is many of the Africans who were taken at this point in time were actually soldiers and militia, skilled in guerrilla warfare, which will become very, very important later. But it's also important to remember that these individuals were mothers, fathers, children. I think the average age of these individuals being taken was 15. They were scientists, they were teachers. These are individuals who were taken from their homeland. The philosophy of slavery in Africa and in Europe at this time was very, very different. If I conquer you and I take your people, you then have your class reset, which meant it didn't matter whether you were of any power in your, say, domain. As soon as you're in my domain, you're at class reset. You have to start again. Now, you then actually become the responsibility of, say, a family. The family can't harm you, but you don't earn any money for your work. But then you might actually eventually earn money for your work, and you can buy your way out of freedom, you can marry your way out of freedom. So it was more equal to, say, the feudal system in England than it was the slave trade, which is about to occur at this time in Western Europe. The Western European perspective on slavery was a racial perspective on slavery, which meant that the further away that you were from Englishness, the more slave-like you were, which meant we had Africans who were slaves and there will never be anything better than slaves, and we have the Englishman, which is supposed to be the idea of higher evolutionary development, or even higher religious development, right? How long do you reckon? Oh, probably like 20 minutes.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Is that right, 20?
Yeah? Is that cool? Now, over this period of time, we see between 10 and 20 million slaves taken from West Africa. And like I said, these individuals had a philosophy, a religion, they had a sense of pride. They had to be broken by the British. We start to see their names being taken away, their religion being taken away from them. The most horrific forms of violence that you might ever see. For example, there's a monument in Montego Bay in Jamaica. And this was a monument dedicated to those who fought in the Baptist War, which we'll cover in a second. And the punishment of some of these individuals was 500 lashes to the back. 500 lashes to the back for rising up against the British. Now, what a lot of people forget is that what they're actually whipped with was a cat of 9 tails, which has 9 whips on it. So a lot of these individuals were taking 4,500 lashes to the back in form of punishment. It would turn your back into a bloody sponge, and you'd be expected to work back on the plantation as soon as you'd recovered again. And this went on for 300 to 400 years. The life expectancy of these Africans working in Jamaica was 7 years, which means you get there at 15 and you're most likely to be worked to death by the time that you're 22. This meant that the turnover of slaves had to be huge. They had to bring more and more Africans into the Caribbean, into America, to work the plantations. The idea of these Africans being passive was an absolute myth. Many Africans on the African continent and in the Caribbean revolted. In fact, 1 in 10 African ships, or 1 in 10 slave ships, encountered slave rebellions on board, where the slaves would try and take over from the captain and navigate themselves back to Africa. Slave rebellions were a regular occurrence, but because the merchant classes were empowered, wide class hedonism took place. It was just about money. Money, money, money. No ethics at all. Which meant that not just the Africans, not just the slaves, but the merchant classes were corrupted. There's an example, for example, there's an example of a man called Thistlewood from Lincolnshire. His peers at the time that he left Lincolnshire to go to Jamaica viewed him as a very normal, upright man. Within months of him being in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, he was in a practice of raping 200 women a year. He whipped the back of 3/4 of his slaves. He came up with his own form of punishment, which is where if one slave was acting not in accordance to how he wanted them to, he would ask another slave to defecate in his mouth and then sew it shut for hours. So what I'm saying here is that it's just disgusting. But what I'm saying here is that when we have the pursuit of greed without ethics, we have the corruption of people widespread. Now, I want to ask you this about the philosophy of empire. If the Egyptian empire intertwined ethics and the economy, and we see the opposite in the British Empire, which is just money, 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 how do you think this would affect a civilization? How do you think this would affect the practices of that civilization? Yeah, so if we have, for example, the ancient Egyptians, who via art intertwined ethics and the economy, and then we had the British Empire, who didn't, where it was more of a decentralized economy, it was just about money, money, money. How do you think this would affect how the people behaved in that empire? Yes?
It would become more radicalized.
More radicalized or more extreme in their behavior? Yeah? Yes, dude?
I think you would have one civilization that's more concerned with pursuing knowledge and developing on that, and another who's constantly trying to profiteer. Yeah, and a perfect example is the merchants in Jamaica used to really despise the working class from England coming over to Jamaica to work, because they used to view them as killjoys, because they'd bring their education, they'd bring their ethics, and they'd bring their Christianity, and they'd stop all the merchant classes from having fun and raping and pillaging all they wanted to. Yeah, so you're going to say something else? Did one of you say? One of you going to? Okay, fine, no problem. All right. Now, so like I said, Mark Carney, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, is now actually suggesting that we need some form of system which intertwines ethics and our economy to stop this ascent of consumerism and selfishness and this wealth divide getting bigger and bigger, and something which actually puts objective value into our economy rather than subjective value. All right. So we're starting to come to the end of the presentation, and the end of the presentation is concerning the triumph of the Africans over the oppressive rule of the British Empire. Now, a few things are starting to happen. We start to see a divide in the ruling classes and the working classes. The merchant classes are starting to get richer and richer and richer, which means the working classes are starting to get poorer and poorer and poorer. Now, this erupts during the French Revolution, where the working class they cut the heads off of the monarchy with guillotines. And at this time, the French island of Haiti, or the French slave colony of Haiti, hear of this, and they also want liberation for themselves. And we see the Bois Cayman ceremony, which is where an enslaved African by the name of Cecile Fatima and an Islamic scholar who is also a slave called Dutty Bookman, they create a ceremony to inspire the Africans to revolt, and they tell the story of a black messiah coming to save them. And that black messiah comes in the form of Tucson Liverpool, who is one of the most remarkable men I've ever read about. He was born into slavery. By the age of 30, he bought himself out of slavery. He set up established businesses by the time he was 50. And by the time he was 50, he wanted to also join the revolution and fight against the oppression of slavery on the French slave island of Haiti. Now, this individual recruited a mixed race army, of which most were African descent, some were mixed race descent. Around 30% of his army were women. Toussaint Louverture was seriously wounded 17 times in battle. He had his teeth blown out, he had his hand crushed, and he didn't stop fighting. He inspired extreme loyalty amongst his men. In fact, there's a story where the Haitian revolutionaries stormed a fort, and they were out of ladders. So they climbed on each other's shoulders under gunfire, and the other Haitian revolutionaries climbed up on them and climbed over the fort and took the fort over a period of hours. He could read and write 3 languages. He would often survive on 4 hours sleep, riding 100 miles in front of his army so he could scout out for any threats to make sure that they weren't harmed. And what is really interesting to me is he was very, very honourable. He inspired honour amongst his revolutionaries. For example, we've told the stories of the insane levels of violence in the Caribbean at that time done towards Africans. But however, he instructed his revolutionaries that if you see any white slave owners evacuating from the war zone, I want you to escort them off the war zone peacefully. And when they were taken to Toussaint Louverture for investigation, the first thing Toussaint Louverture asked the slave owners is, did any of my men harm you? And they would also always answer, no, not a hair has been touched on my head. What is quite interesting, Toussaint Louverture is very stoic by nature. One of the stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, said that, who was a Roman emperor, said that the best revenge is to be unlike the individual who has harmed you. And that seems to be very much in the practice of Tucson Liverpool. They used guerrilla tactics where they might storm a fort over here and they'd have pockets of individuals all over running through the trees, zigzagging, popping off guns as they go until they'd eventually surround the enemy and finish them or draw them into surrender. Very, very intelligent individual. He defeated the French, the Spanish, the British, and Napoleon Bonaparte himself. And he founded the first democracy, founded by enslaved people who had overthrown their oppressor. However, unfortunately, shortly after he was kidnapped, sent to France, and he was kept captive in a tower in eastern France until he died of pneumonia. But what he did do is he started to create an element of fear amongst the Caribbean and amongst the Americas. And shortly after, we see all the slave colonies falling like dominoes, which led to the Baptist War in 1831, which I have around 5 family members on that monument who fought in this war. The Industrial Revolution at the time was built on slavery. When we hear of the Industrial Revolution, we hear about cotton, tobacco, sugar. All of these things were taken from the Americas, silk from India. All these things were taken from the Commonwealth, and they were milled in Britain. It meant it kept more money in Britain. This meant the building of huge cities like Bristol, Liverpool, London, West India Docks, Canary Wharf, for example. There were at this point, there was no sign of slavery slowing down in the West Indies. Until a man called Samuel Sharp, who was a Baptist preacher who toured the island, preaching to the enslaved population. He started to read deeply into the Bible and started to extract key messages from, say, Exodus, the liberation of slaves, the triumph of the Jews over slavery in Egypt. And he started to draw inspiration from this. He developed fantastic oratory skills until one night he gathered a few of his friends around and he said that we are going to inspire a revolution. With the argument, the historical documents point to the fact that he said first it's going to be peaceful and then it's going to be a violent takeover. And they wanted to set up a free democracy on the island of Jamaica. There's a story. There's diaries written out at the time, where there's a man, a watchman, looking over the horizon of Jamaica, and he starts to see on the horizon a spark, a fire, and then another fire, and another fire, and another fire, and they start to grow and grow and grow until he has to write to the militia. And as you can see, as he's writing to the militia, his hand's starting to shake. And he signs it off by saying, I don't think I'm going to be here tomorrow because I think the Africans are revolting against us in Jamaica. They burnt plantations, they burnt property. Once again, they were extremely honourable in many situations, often going into the big houses where the slave owners were and said, you need to leave right now. And the slave owners would say, no, we're not leaving. We're the masters here, blah, blah, blah. Go off and go to bed. And then 6 more Africans would come into the house and say, no, we really need you to leave right now. They would leave, and within 100 metres of leaving their home, they'd look back and their house would be in flames and the plantations would be burned into the ground. Now, eventually, the British squashed, the British reinforcements squashed the revolution, or the Baptist War in Jamaica. And Samuel Sharp surrendered himself because he didn't want other Baptist ministers being punished for what he did. And one of his last words were, I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery. And that's just before they hung him. 1 year later, after this, previous to the Baptist War, slavery had no sign of slowing down. 1 year after the slaves were emancipated, they had their freedom in Jamaica, 1 year after the Baptist War, because slavery was regarded as becoming unprofitable and too fearful to endure. Now, Mark, this is one question to you. Egypt, West Africa, Moorish Empire, the Maharaja empires, in these empires, disunity contributed to their fall. However, in the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Baptist War, these succeeded because of unity. First question is, what can you do to ensure your unity amongst each other as a people? What can you do to, go on, Communication, any others?
You need an ethos.
Sorry, ethos, what, a common ethos? Yeah. Common philosophy, any others to,
Get behind something like a religion Or like an ID.
Or common belief system. Yeah, absolutely. Any others? Yeah.
Learn about each other.
Learn about each other, 100%. So we talk about communication, finding commonality, despite differences, I would say. Yeah. One thing that we also can't ignore is the contribution of many British people to the emancipation of slavery. We have Elizabeth Barrett, who was a writer. We have William Knibbs, who was a Baptist preacher who knew Samuel Sharp. And we also have William Wilberforce. Now, these individuals campaigned for the emancipation of slavery. Ironically, when slavery did end in 1833, the British paid out a compensation, not to the slaves, but to the slave owners, of 20 million. That was 40% of the national budget, which would be the equivalent of £350 billion today. That money is still in circulation today. That money was used to found Barclays Bank, was invested into Royal Bank of Scotland, was invested into the National Rail, all of that from the compensation of payouts from slavery. Now, I want to come back to the hero story with you. The hero, which we spoke about in ancient Egypt, represents our internal struggle against adversity, triumph over adversity. It is important that we can see ourselves as the hero and autonomous in our own being. That might be at university, might be at work, sport, culture. Now, I want to ask you this. Who's heard of Abraham Lincoln? What is he famous for?
Abolishing slavery.
Abolishing slavery. And with the British Empire and the story that you might have heard of the emancipation of slavery before, who thought that slaves were given their freedom because of the kindness of the British, because the British saw the good of their ways? Yeah? That's what I learned. Is that something that you guys learned, or did it not kind of cross your mind why slavery actually ended? Okay, fine, no problem. Now, I want to ask you this. Why do you see the familiarity? Do you think these two look alike? Do you think these two look alike? Okay. So Julia Roberts was casted to play Harriet Tubman, who rescued numerous slaves from American slave owners, right? When it comes to the depiction of ancient Egypt, put your hand up if most images that you've seen in Hollywood of ancient Egypt have been of people looking of European descent. White people, yeah. Okay. So my question is this. What is the harm in taking someone's hero story away from them? For example, if you were to do a load of work at school and he was to take the credit and you were completely written out of all that work, how would that make you feel? Robbed. Any other emotions? Powerless? Any other emotions or feelings? If someone took the credit for something that you did? Angry. 100%. And this is the issue by not having an accurate depiction of history. If we can't see ourselves in the triumph that has taken place in history, it can rob us of our identity, of our esteem, of our sense of self. Now, shortly after this, we have the greatest wars that ashamedly have occurred in the history of mankind. We had the imperial forces of Western Europe coming head to head during World War I and World War II. And we see many members of the Commonwealth drafted. Now, 2.9 million British troops served in World War II. How many black and brown people do you think served in World War II from the Commonwealth?
1.8.
Sorry?
1.8.
Oh. I'll give you a clue. 2.4 million Indians alone served. How many do you think served in total? Sorry? 10. No, not quite. So you had 2.9 million British people served. We had 2.4 million Indians. And we had 500,000 Africans and tens of thousands from the Caribbean. So the numbers of African and Indian, or people of African and Indian descent, actually outnumbered the British when it comes to those who were drafted into World War II. However, this isn't quite represented when it comes to our Hollywood depictions. Post-war Britain, we have the Windrush, where the British asked for help in the Commonwealth, and they asked individuals from Africa, India, New Zealand, Australia and Canada to help to come to the UK to start to build it back up after World War II.
So, who, before I start picking people, who wants to go? Who wants to interview?
I'll do it.
Yeah? One more? Any girls? Would you like to do it? Would you like to do it? Yeah? That's good for diversity. That's good.
One brown, one black, one white.
Yeah, we've got to go now though, unfortunately.
All right. So, so Britain campaigned to the Commonwealth, and they wanted more and more workers to come to Britain to serve. Right. Now they wanted, or they expected, only those of English descent to answer the calls. However, they didn't. Those of African and Indian descent answered the calls. Now, by the time that those individuals on those ships were coming to England, before they even docked, there were already petitions to send them back. At the same time, we start to experience economic downturns and after World War II due to a lack of work. And the immigrants were predictably blamed. Why do you think that often during economic downturns or times of internal national conflict, immigrants are often blamed for the downfall of a country? Yes?
Seen as a scapegoat.
Seen as a scapegoat, yeah, that's a good point.
Himself from the failure of the country.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
Well, they always relied, during the war, they always relied on the Indians and the black people, so they would expect to rely on these people now as well.
Right, but what I'm asking is, why do you think that during economic downturn, the immigrants are often looked at to blame? Are you saying because they're taking the work?
No, I'm saying because they're essentially causing the economic downturn. So how they used to rely on them in the wars, they're trying to rely on them now, but they're not doing anything. So that's why they maybe.
Yeah, it was actually the opposite. So there were more and more people. There were more and more immigrants coming into the UK at the time to help. So they were pulling their weight. Yeah. Any others? Suggestions? Now, on your point at the back right, when you're talking about immigrants being used as a scapegoat, Robert Sapolsky, who's a neurobiologist, he wrote that based on studies that he's found, that for one individual who's higher up on the hierarchical ladder to express anger towards someone who is lower on the hierarchical ladder, that person will experience a significant reduction in stress. This person will experience a significant increase in stress. So for example, you guys might have little brothers and sisters, or you might have older brothers or older sisters, and you might notice that the older brother will often take their aggression out on the younger brother, or that the older brother is less likely to challenge the parents, but he will challenge the younger brother or younger sister, right? Now, that's something that's unfortunately built into us genetically, but it's something to observe, that we have a tendency to take out our aggression on those who we feel are lesser than us, which is why a employee will be more likely to challenge or express anger or frustration against the employee below them rather than their manager, right? Due to a combination of police brutality and unequal job opportunities, we see tension start to develop more and more in the UK, racial tension. The New Cross fire occurs in 1981. These are protests here. In 1981, where an arsonist burnt a home in New Cross in South London, and 13 young black children were killed, and there was no police investigation. No one was found guilty. We see disproportionate stop and search occurring in Brixton. We then get the Brixton Riots in 1981. In 1993, a young aspiring architect, Stephen Lawrence, was waiting at a bus stop, and he was attacked by 5 English youths who stabbed him to death. The police assumed that Stephen Lawrence was involved in gang violence, and therefore assumed that he was killed by another black male. They didn't investigate properly, they contaminated the evidence, and all 5 suspects were found, there was no charges pressed against the 5 suspects until evidence later on, due to technological advancements, were able to then bring that evidence in and then actually send 2 of those individuals to jail. An inquiry which was performed after the death of Steve Lawrence found the police to be institutionally racist. And then today we have, last year the death of George Floyd, with protests internationally because of the synonymous relationship when it comes to racialised violence between individuals in Britain and in America. Because today we obviously still a disproportionate amount of black deaths in police custody in the US and the UK, and a disproportionate, a low number of arrests comparatively per capita when it comes to those who are stop and search, who are of the black community in the UK. Very few end up in arrest, which indicate that they're overly policed. And since then, we've seen movements to try and produce equality in the US and the UK. Now, I'd say today that we have a very complex history which has provided us with a very complex framework to navigate. We have inherited, unfortunately, a racialised philosophy which has left marks which are still statistically palpable today. There's hard evidence for ethnicity affecting CV application, submission and recalls for interviews. There's correlations between race and health outcomes, earning potential regardless of education. And it seems that there is an underlying narrative which might stem from empire. And it's made increasingly difficult to navigate by a media or a source of media which tend to polarize. You don't really get truth down the middle, you tend to get the extremes represented. Now, my question to you is, over this past hour and a bit that we've been talking, has this changed your perspective on history at all? Put your hands up if it has. Okay. And I'd just like to ask, how has it changed your perspective of history? Yeah?
I didn't really know much about history. Like, I just knew that there was slavery and then there was not slavery.
Oh, so contextualised it a bit.
So
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, dude.
I don't know if he was like as linked as that.
Oh, okay. So this is a very simplified version. This is me taking key components in different parts of that do mean something to another component. I'm just showing how the chess pieces have moved throughout time. And yeah, 100%. We are without a doubt all intrinsically linked. Whether you call that the butterfly effect or cause and effect, history has shaped who we are today. So yeah, 100%. So you're going to say something else after that? Okay, cool. Yeah, someone else over here? Yes.
I was just going to say it shows like all of the little details that we don't really get taught. So it like opens your eyes a bit.
Open your eyes a bit. Okay, very good. Yes, dude.
It's interesting to see the other side of like slavery and stuff, where we're taught all the British side of slavery, but now we see the African, West African side of slavery as well.
Do you think that the depiction of slavery before was a bit kind of reductionist, or maybe a bit overly simplified, or a bit too clean? Yeah. Okay, right, cool. Yes, dude.
It was quite simplified. It wasn't clean. We saw the same images of the whipping thing in the books, but it was definitely simplified. We didn't get to see the extent or the revolutions that came past that.
Ah, okay.
It's like an
imperialist view of it. Yeah. I think that. Okay, I want to ask this question just based on what you said and what you said as well. Did you previously, in your minds, empower those of African descent as overthrowing slavery? Did you think that the Africans had overthrown slavery, or did you view it as a gift that was given to them? A gift that was given to them. Okay, right. Yeah, so that is how very, very, very different the real affairs were back then. I think we have to understand. We have to put into perspective how much the British relied on slavery as income. Very, very quickly after the emancipation of slavery, they quickly then went into colonialism, which is where during the Berlin Conference in 1884, Western European superpowers essentially sat around a table with a map of Africa, and they carved it into a map. And the Italians said, we'll take this bit. The English said, we'll take this bit. The Germans and the French said that we'll take this bit. And then they started to manipulate their way into the African establishments and the Indian establishments, for example, during the British Raj, to start to take control over what we now call today the Commonwealth. All right, and even the British Raj is a topic in itself, right? the difference between, say, African colonialism or the transatlantic slave trade and the British Raj is India was treated like a cash cow, had to keep its infrastructure, but the individuals were taxed at 50%. They were forced at gunpoint to give up their possessions. The silk trade in India was huge at the time, but they wanted to mill the silk in Britain. So what they did is they broke the thumbs of those in India who would mill the silk. And if the wives of the men refused to pay tax, they would take sharpened bamboo shoots and shove them down the nipples of the man's wife. So this is, and it comes back to, have you guys covered Lord of the Flies?
Yeah.
Right, so did you learn about the group of boys whose own primal and primitive instincts overtakes them when they have a lack of order? That's essentially what happened in the commonwealth. That's what happened in the British Empire, right? We see men who are corrupted beyond all measure in the pursuit of money, regardless of whatever means they have to use, right? Now, my view is that despite all this, human beings have helped each other far, far more than they have taken away. Otherwise, we'd still be hunter-gatherers in North Africa, right? The net contribution of human beings to each other has been far higher than the net amount that we've taken away from each other, right? I propose that we should be going towards equality of opportunity above all else. And it's because it benefits the consumer and the provider. If I'm being treated by a surgeon, I don't want to be treated by a surgeon who just got there because of who his parents were. I want to be treated by that surgeon who is, no matter what their background is, the best that they could possibly be. Same thing when it comes to a mortgage advisor or a barrister or a lawyer or an osteopath or a teacher. I want to be helped by the person who has the most merit in being able to help me, right? And this means equal access to the workforce, education, and to reduce stereotyping by soft measures like education. I advise you all to be curious. Use your British manners to ask questions. For example, I could say to you, excuse me, I hope you don't mind if I ask you this, but I'm just generally curious. I like speaking about culture. Would you mind telling me what your roots are? Now, did you find that offensive at all? Now, if I say to you, well, where are you from then? Was that offensive? Right, just use your British manners. Be polite, be curious. Every single person that you meet is an absolute library of information, of different cultural norms, different beliefs. Every single person can enlighten your experience of the world. Now, my mission is I've set up Black History School to educate people on Black history, mainly in schools. But as well as that, I'm starting to write a comic book series to start to bring these African heroes to life in comic books, to start to educate the youth. Because for me, growing up, not being able to see myself in the history books was quite distressing. To be told that you are nothing, you've descended from nothing but a slave is quite distressing. It's quite a nasty thing to believe. I was incredibly enlightened and my self-esteem was lifted by learning my history, so I'm trying to do that for others. Thank you so much for your patience today. I'm fully aware that we've been talking for almost, and I've been talking for almost an hour and 40 minutes, but you've been so patient, you've been so amazing. Thank you so much for your contributions as well. I've really appreciated it. Thank you so much for your time today.